Hello, it's Jen Taub. Welcome back to Booked Up, a podcast that features you, me, and our favorite authors. This week, my guest is Carissa Byrne Hessick. Carissa teaches at the UNC School of Law and has a very fancy title, the Anne Shea Ransdell and William Garland Buck Ransdell Jr. Distinguished Professor of Law. She is also director of the Prosecutors in Politics Project. Today, I'll be talking with Carissa about her remarkable book, Punishment Without Trial: Why Plea Bargaining is a Bad Deal. Let's dive in. Hey there.
Hey, how are you?
Good. So nice to finally meet an animated you instead of just your presence on Twitter.
Back at you, for sure.
What's the weather like in North Carolina at the moment?
It is finally not that cold. We're getting up to the high 60s, possibly even 70 today. So the weather I moved here for is finally here.
Where'd you move from?
I was at the University of Utah before this, so very different weather.
But that's gorgeous, I'm sure.
Beautiful, nice skiing. Actually, like a really, really, really lovely town to live in, but pretty far away from family, and so lots of airplane rides with little kids and stuff like that.
So families, I was picking up, I'm a little bit of an unusual reader. Like, I read for content, but I also try to scout out the personal details of someone's life. And you don't hide them in this book. I mean, you write in the first person, even though it's very detailed and smart, you're in it. And somewhere like halfway into the book, I find out a little bit about your childhood. So you moved a lot, though, as a kid. So right?
I did. Yeah, my dad was in the military. And so, he did his 29 years for the U.S. Navy. And those overlapped with my childhood. He retired right when I graduated from high school. So every 1 to 3 years, we would pick up and move someplace new. And it was, I loved it. I think it's hard on some people. Like, my sisters were more introverted than I was, so it was more difficult for them. But as somebody who, took a job where I get to stand up in front of a lot of people and talk for a living, I was always just like, this is an adventure. I'm so excited to meet new people.
So I'm a little bit like that, but I can imagine for your siblings it might have been annoying. But what bases? My father was briefly in the Navy. So I'm curious.
Really?
Yeah, I didn't even think of it until it's so funny. Until you say it now, I never really counted it as anything other than during the Vietnam War, he enlisted and we lived, on a military base or near one in Long Beach. But I never thought of it as being I've never thought of myself as a military brat, but now I like that I can add that to my profile. But back to you, Carissa. What bases were you on?
Yeah. So my dad also enlisted during Vietnam, but then he just stayed in and did almost a full 30.
Wow.
Yeah. So they lived all over. Some of the bases aren't around anymore. At some point, he was stationed on Nantucket, which is probably I can only imagine what a deal it was to live in base housing on Nantucket, although I hear it's not very nice in the winter.
Yeah, I don't think so.
He was stationed in Puerto Rico when I was born. I don't speak any Spanish or anything like that, but that's where they lived.
Were you born in San Juan or somewhere?
I was born in a military hospital in Roosevelt Road, but I was almost born on the car ride there because apparently it was a very long drive to get to and so my parents love to tell the story that instead of just the regular sort of birthing classes that everyone takes about breathing and when to go to the hospital, they also would teach the husbands how to deliver a baby because a bunch of them would end up delivering the baby in the back of the car.
I can't imagine almost anything worse than that.
I'm just childbirth is traumatic enough. Who wants to add that in?
Oh, my God. Okay. I'm not going to ask you any more details about childbirth or the birth of your children because that would be a whole other conversation. But I do want to I do want to ask, but I'm not going to go there because I just feel like this is booked up, not Prego podcast. So we can't do that unless you want to.
If I can say one more vaguely pregnancy-related thing.
Okay, good.
I appreciate you mentioning that the book was written in the first person, and at various points I relate things back to my own life. I did that because I'm not a huge consumer of nonfiction, not for leisure. I mean, I read tons of nonfiction for my job, like I'm sure you do as well.
Right.
But I read it more to be informed than to be sort of entertained. But one of the nonfiction books that just stuck with me is called Expecting Better. It was written by this economist, Emily Oster, and it's basically an economist talks to you about pregnancy. And the book came out before I had my second kid, and someone mentioned to me, it's a fascinating read that really helps people navigate all of the sort of conflicting advice about being pregnant. But the book is written in the first person, and she opens with, her finding out that she herself was pregnant and feeling so overwhelmed, and it led her to do all of this research. And the book is largely just, health research and explaining.
So it's like bait and switch.
Analysis.
Like the first sentence, you think it's all friendly, but after that, they're just throwing a bunch of numbers at you and charts.
But I found it so easy to read because as she's throwing all of these charts at you, and she's like, so that's how I would decide it was okay to eat sushi. Boom, 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 boom. And it stuck with me as, I think, and I'd be interested to know how you feel about this because I know you've written books and I love Big Dirty Money. We're motivated to write these books because it's something that we feel sort of deeply about. And at times it was hard for me to separate myself completely from the material. I don't know if you feel that way. I mean, I can certainly tell from your reading that you feel very passionately about what you're writing about. I mean, I don't know. You tell me. Like, this was my first book. It was. You've done it more than once.
You hit it out of the park because I think it's a big risk to speak in the first person in any kind of book. I mean, in a nonfiction book, I suppose, unless you're setting out to write a memoir, and you did it so well. And I have often pushed mostly to the margins, like in the past, in the acknowledgments, I tell my story, right? Mm-hmm. But I haven't integrated. And there's like a moment maybe in Big Dirty Money, like where I place myself kind of like breaking through the wall. It's like, and reader, I indicted him. No, but it was like, I don't really appear there. And for this next book I'm working on, I think I'm going to do it. But you do it well. And I think what I like in particular is the way in which you share not just the fact that you've interviewed some of the people that I'm going to ask you to talk about, but the evolution of your thinking around some of these issues. Because I know you a little bit from Twitter, and you don't shy away from pushing back. That's the word you use here. You're laughing. Because before I knew you, I'm like, God, she really likes to get in a fight with people. And sometimes I don't know. So I don't know that I'm always that confrontational. I tend to be sarcastic or I just block. But you really have these debates, and I see why, because I think you're one of these people who, when you get additional information and through the process of debate, I think you refine your thinking and maybe you'll move off of a position. And you actually show people how to do that in this book. I've never quite seen anyone do that. And especially, do you want to talk about your argument with Shima Baradharan? How do you pronounce her new last name?
Now it's Boffman now. So it's Shima Baradharan Boffman. That's right. She's challenging me for how many names you can string together.
So that had to do with, do you want to talk about that? But the funny part is the way you're sort of like, well, I pushed back, and then you kind of leave it hanging, and I'm like, well, do you agree with her or not? And then later you kind of circle back to it. So you want to remind me of what that was about?
Yeah, so Shima Baradharan Boffman is another law professor, and she, among other things, writes really fantastic stuff about pretrial detention and bail, right? So the practice of when someone's been charged with a crime, but they haven't yet been convicted, do they get to stay in their own homes while their case is being processed and potentially going to trial, or do they have to stay in jail while all of that is happening? And, sometimes they're allowed to go home, but only if they post bail, like give a bunch of money to make sure that they come back. And Shima's written really wonderful things about this. And she has a particular point of view, which is that she thinks that money plays a huge role in the problems that we see in the criminal justice system. And in particular, she was talking about how these bail bonds companies have a huge financial stake in making sure that states and prosecutors and courts keep up this system of bail because, you know, Jen, if you got arrested and you had to post $100,000 worth of bail, I'm assuming that you wouldn't be able to
go higher on me. Go higher than that. I want to have a number like SBF. Anyhow, yeah, let's just say 100,000.
But let's just say you don't have 100,000 cash lying around someplace where you could just write a check. So what you would probably do is you would go to a bail bonds company and you would have to pay them some fraction of that amount, and then they would be on the hook if you didn't show up. They would then have to pay the money.
But I never get my money back. It's kind of like an insurance premium, right?
You never get the money back. So if you have to pay $10,000 for them to post your bond, that $10,000 never comes back, even if you're acquitted, right? If the charges are dismissed or you're acquitted, you never get that money back. So Shima's point was, we have these systems in part because of the profit motive that's pushing the bail companies to keep things the way that they are.
A multi-billion-dollar business, right? I mean, it's no joke. A
multi-billion-dollar business. And she said, you know, look, campaign contributions, blah, 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 all of this stuff. And I had just been doing a bunch of work on campaign contributions in prosecutor elections, and I could confidently say that there's very little money from bail bonds companies in these elections. I mean, there's money, don't get me wrong, and we could talk about the source of some of that money and how it might skew elections. But there was almost no money from the bail bonds companies in these elections.
And you said in the elections of prosecutors.
Elections of prosecutors. Now, I have to say, she made a pretty persuasive point, though, that these bail bonds companies are still throwing around a lot of money. Maybe they're not sending it to prosecutors, but, you know, there are some groups, Color of Change, for example, they've done work to show that these companies really do give a lot of money. Maybe they're giving it to people who are running for the state legislature instead of to the prosecutors, but that we shouldn't discount the role that money plays. And I have to say, like, that was a fair point, right? It's whatever the Supreme Court might tell us, and I think your snippet about their cases involving corruption and money is just such a devastating critique. Thank you for that. Whatever the Supreme Court might tell us about how campaign contributions are not a source of corruption in our system, it is impossible, I think, to believe that somebody is going to take a bunch of money from an industry and then vote against that industry's interests. Like, that's just, It strains credulity. I don't know how they write those opinions with a straight face, but they write them. So,
well, what's funny is you kind of go, well, maybe, with the argument with Shima, and then a Professor Bowman. But then later, though, it's like you're kind of cogitating over this and thinking more about the role of money. And it comes to another topic, and maybe I should back up just so I don't get myself lost. But I just want to check to make sure, you know, like a good student, that I understood. I want to make sure I understood. I think what you're sort of the intellectual project here, that the central argument of punishment without bail is not just about what the subtitle says, because the subtitle says why plea bargaining is a bad deal. And it's always hard to write a subtitle that encompasses everything. It's not plea bargaining is kind of at the center, but there are other kinds of punishment without trial. So in addition to plea bargaining, you talk about pretrial detention, which is this bail piece we've been talking about. And you talk about civil forfeiture, and you talk about these other fees. And I think it's in your discussion of civil forfeiture that you get to the realization about how important money is. But before I ask you about that, I just want to make sure that if these are the kind of three areas, it seems like what at least pretrial detention, civil forfeiture, and all these fees, like booking fees and so on, have in common is that they feed into the pressure on people who are accused of crimes to just go ahead and enter a plea. And what that ends up doing is it sort of abandons a search for truth. It prizes efficiency over due process. It plays into the unequal bargaining power that anyone has, but especially the poor and people of color have against a much powerful state. And all this gets me to the Supreme Court. What amazes me is that chapter by chapter, when you talk about this, you're like, and here's how the Supreme Court looked the other way. So is that like, is that the answer to everything, that we just need the court to do a better job? Or if that's unrealistic, and it's, sorry, let me say it differently, which is, it's like once you've got a giant industry, the court it's not going to just like stop. It's not going to shut down a whole industry. So did I first step back and say, did I understand your book, or what did I leave out about what you're trying to write about?
No, you're entirely right. I set out to write a book about plea bargaining, and as I was writing the book, I realized that it's not just that we have this thing called plea bargaining and it creates problems. It's that in part, we have this thing called plea bargaining because we no longer believe that we should have to have a trial to convict and punish someone. We've just, as a society, maybe the average American doesn't know this, but in terms of people who work within the criminal justice system, that's not where they are anymore. That might be the Schoolhouse Rock version of how the criminal justice system is supposed to work. Somebody is accused, they have a trial. If they're convicted, we punish them. That's not what we do. It's somebody gets accused, and we start punishing them, period. And sometimes those people will get a trial. Most often they won't, in part because of plea bargaining. But the other things that you've talked about, right? Pretrial detention, having to pay money bail, all of these fees and fines, civil forfeiture, I think they're all of a piece. We allow all of these things to happen in part because we are okay, those people in the system are okay punishing people without ever having a trial. Plea bargaining makes all of those things worse. If it weren't for plea bargaining, I don't think that pretrial detention would look the way it does if not for plea bargaining. There's a, if you made one of those graphs showing like changes over time and you plotted things like number of plea bargains and number of people being held pretrial or even dollars seized in civil forfeiture, you'll notice that they all bump up around the same time.
Yes, I saw that.
I'm not
like
an economist.
Early 1990s? Is that what it was?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we got really good at this in the 1990s. I'm not an economist. Like, I'm not going to be able to do the statistical analysis to show you that there's a causal
I'll do that.
But okay. But yeah, I think, again, ordinary Americans, to the extent that they see these things, they're not dummies. Like, oh yeah, like if you tell me I can go home today if I plead guilty, or I can sit in jail for 2 weeks waiting for a court date, I'm going to plead guilty.
We don't know if correlation equals causation, but there's one other piece that I think I left out, which you mentioned, near and dear to my heart, which is the Sentencing Commission. And sentencing, which many people don't know, that a judge can consider things that you, Carissa, were accused of, where there wasn't even a trial, in your sentencing.
Yeah.
And that plays into a whole bunch of reasons why you need to have the judge on your side, because if you nail down what the sentence is, it's not a surprise. But if you go to trial and lose on something that isn't, you think, that big of a deal, a judge could go to the maximum sentence and not, under the guidelines, which is a lot higher than you might have ordinarily gotten based on your background or the severity of the offense for something they didn't even have an evidence on against you, as long as it's sort of in the same ballpark.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, you mentioned before that in the book, I'm always like, and then the Supreme Court, dun, 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 dun. It's funny. I think, especially as law professors, we spend a lot of time talking about judges, especially in the criminal system. And then the judge sort of stepped in and said, no, this constitutional right is important. And that's just not what's happened here. Like, not only are judges not the hero of the story, we can trace a lot of the problems that we have to the Supreme Court just literally refusing to enforce the Constitution as written. There's a particular case, I was actually just talking about it with my students yesterday in class. They read this case, Borden-Kircher versus Hayes, where the prosecutor says to this defendant, I'm going to offer you a plea deal of 5 years, and if you don't take it, I'm going to re-indict you under this recidivism statute, and you will serve a mandatory life sentence. And the guy's like, well, I wrote a bad check for $90. Like, I'm not going to take a 5-year deal on that. So the prosecutor re-indicted him. He got convicted of this, whatever, passing a bad check, forgery, whatever the relatively minor crime was.
Right.
And he took his case to the Supreme Court and he said, look, you guys have all of these cases that say government actors can't retaliate against people just because they've invoked their constitutional rights. I invoked my constitutional right to a jury trial under the Sixth Amendment, and this guy retaliated against me. And the prosecutor, you know, the state didn't deny it. They're like, that's right, that's exactly what happened, and it should be fine. And if you're going to have plea bargaining, you have to expect things like this to happen. And the Supreme Court was basically like, I guess that's true. If we're going to have plea bargaining, we can't really enforce the Constitution. And that's their opinion.
Okay, so I'm so glad you said that because it's horrifying, and it also gets us really nerdy, the possibility of talking about the doctrine of unconstitutional conditions. So let's just do this. Let's just do it. So before we do that, make me smarter. You talk about things change, but let's step back. Give me the full-on history of when plea bargaining was frowned on, when folks discovered in the 20s, holy moly, or after the 20s, this is really happening. A lot, and then how, since I graduated from law school, this thing has gotten even more ubiquitous to the point that I'm embarrassed, for anyone who teaches crim law who actually teaches the doctrine anymore. I know that you bargain against the shadow of really sentencing, but we don't even teach much about that. Anyhow, but go for it. Tell me how the story changed, and what that means.
Yeah. So there was this Schoolhouse Rock version of criminal law, right? You would get accused of a crime, there would be a trial, and you would either get convicted or acquitted. And you know what? Like, a decent number of people were getting acquitted. Like, the acquittal rate wasn't small. But we know that at least starting in the early 1800s, that in some places, prosecutors would sort of be creative and say, look, you know what? If you'll plead guilty, so George Fisher has this great book called Plea Bargaining's Triumph, and he found some records from some old Massachusetts courts, and he says, I found this guy, and he came up with this idea that for these liquor violations, he could have somebody with 5 liquor violations, and he says, hey, if you plead guilty to one of them, you only have to pay the fine once. How about you do that? And he got in trouble with the state legislature because they're like, why aren't you collecting all of the fines that are owed? And he said, my caseload's too big. And the state legislature was like, oh, okay, all right. But he was the exception rather than the rule. And when people would find out that these sorts of things were happening, they would usually get upset. They thought it seemed corrupt, right, for the prosecutor to be letting people get away with it, which I know you know a lot about that as someone who studies white-collar crime. You're like, why are the prosecutors letting people get away with this? But it wasn't it seems as though they were relatively isolated incidents, or that there were like some prosecutors' offices where it was happening, but it wasn't widespread. If a defendant later on challenged it in court, the appellate courts would refuse to enforce these bargains. They said the prosecutor doesn't have the power to do this. There's some dicta from a Supreme Court case around the time of the Civil War where they refused to enforce a plea bargain, saying the prosecutor doesn't have the power to do this. But fast forward to the crime commissions of like the 1930s, where academics and local leaders were trying to get at the bottom of what was happening in the urban criminal courts, in part because they were worried about crime and in part because they were worried about corruption.
And this is the rise, by the way, this is when sociology and criminology blossom as fields, because that's right around when Sutherland. Oh, anyway, go ahead.
No, it's true. It's true. This stuff is all connected, right? So they start thinking it's not enough to know what the law is. We have to see what's happening, right? It's a very sort of social science approach to the courts. And they, quote unquote, discovered plea bargaining, and people were outraged. I mean, like the Illinois state legislature was talking about impeaching judges for allowing this to happen in their courtroom. People were angry, but the problem was they found it so many different places that I think everyone was sort of like, it's like once you realize that it's happening everywhere, it's hard to say it's outrageous and corrupt because everyone can say, well, is it outrageous or corrupt, or is it just sort of...
Well, they didn't want to write a check, right? Because then you'd have to raise taxes. You've got to hire more prosecutors. You've got to build more courthouses. You have to have more judges. This was sort of like, seemed like a bargain.
All of those things. But then once the cat's out of the bag, then the legislatures get involved with it. So, there's an interview with this former prosecutor who helped revise New York State's criminal code in the 1960s. And he gave some interview to some law professor somewhere, and they reprinted it in the Buffalo Law Review. And they're asking him a bunch of questions, and they're like, did plea bargaining play any role in your decisions? And he's like, oh, yeah, no, we structured the entire criminal code with the assumption that everyone would be plea bargaining. So now it's less of
my God.
Less of this is corrupt, people aren't getting what they deserved, and it's more that plea bargaining is the backdrop against which our laws are being written, and it really starts to skew everything, right? So, there's an exchange where Chuck Grassley, who at the time was chairing the Judiciary Committee, was holding a hearing where a bunch of people, including some Republicans, are like, you know what? Our drug sentences are too high. Somebody who's a relatively low-level mule will get 5-year sentences. And he's like, oh, yeah. He's like, yeah, no, I got that data. And it looks like most of them are pleading out and not getting the mandatory minimum sentence. So really the system's working the way it's supposed to. We're plea bargaining around this law and not enforcing it. That's the way things should be. Why would we change the law? It would disrupt the system of pressure on people to plead guilty.
And it makes it very difficult to explain this to, quote, the public or my students this happened to be on Twitter the other day. Someone said, oh, this person was facing, it may have been Sam Bankman-Fried, they're facing how many hundreds of years. And I'm like, no, where did you see that? Because you can't just look at the statute. The statutes, and by the way, the white-collar crime statutes don't have mandatory minimums. They have mandatory maximums. And then you just you got to pop over to the sentencing guidelines and then just go ahead and take a look at the prosecution's memo in the Elizabeth Holmes case and see what they say are the maximums in this kind of situation. This dude's not getting more than that guy. So it's so interesting how it's interesting. And I didn't think until reading your book that it's not that this system is a lot about that in theory, the outlying chance that the prosecutors want to push for it, it's that gamble. And it's a really terrible gamble. It can lead to really sad results. And I'm forgetting what his name is. Who was the ethical hacker, Aaron somebody? What is his last name?
Oh, yes. Aaron Swartz.
Aaron Swartz, who they threatened him. I think they overcharged him for what was he done? Breaking into some computer room to download Lexis or something.
Yeah, he was downloading, articles from
Hein Online or something,
Hein Online
right?
To make them free. Which, by the way, that's the sort of civil disobedience I can get behind for sure.
So he goes into this locked room to use Harvard or MIT's computers or whatever to download academic articles for which there's exorbitant paywalls. And because this probably was a violation of, one of the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act type statutes, and they said you could get this, and either you plead out or you're going to do this, and this is a young kid, and he committed suicide.
Yeah.
And I know that's one example, but there are many examples whether people, they take the plea, you've got them in your book, and their life can be really altered. And before I get to those people, because they're really the sort of heroes in the stories of this book, there's one more story about you that I wanted to ask about. So right after, you say in the book that sometime after law school, when you were working for, I'm assuming it was a federal judge, you were clerking.
Oh, yeah. Mm-hmm.
And you witnessed something, and I wonder if you can tell me about that and how it impacted you, that related to someone trying to argue they were indigent and wanted a lawyer. And then wait, we've got to get back to unconstitutional conditions. We will, but first tell me this story.
Sure. So this was so like a lot of people when I graduated from law school, I did one of those stints where you work for a judge for not a lot of money, but it's great experience, and you get to work with the judge and help draft things and those sorts of things. And my judge was a former federal prosecutor, and she was really big on having the clerk sit in the courtroom, even if she didn't really need us for something in particular on the case, so we could see what was happening in these cases. And as most people probably know, because they've heard police officers on television give someone the Miranda warning that if you don't have a lawyer, one will be, if you can't afford a lawyer, one will be appointed for you. But the way these things work in court is you have to prove to the court that you can't afford a lawyer before they will appoint one for you. And lawyers are really expensive. So this guy had been charged with, I can't remember what, and he was not dirt poor. He wasn't living on the streets. He wasn't homeless. He wasn't sleeping on somebody's couch. He had a job and he owned a car. And it wasn't like a super expensive car, but it wasn't nothing. The car was worth however many, tens of thousands of dollars. Not a lot, but it wasn't a beater. And the argument that was being made was that the judge couldn't appoint this guy a lawyer because he hadn't.
Wait. Stop. You said the argument that was being made. I don't like passive voice. Tell me who was making the argument.
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know if it was pretrial
I think in the book you said it was the prosecutor.
Oh, I'm sorry. Maybe it was pretrial services. Maybe it was the prosecutor. Whoever's in charge of this. If it was the prosecutor, it was the gatekeeper of pretrial services. But whoever's in charge of that gatekeeping question, was saying this guy doesn't qualify because he has assets, right? He could sell this car. And it was clear to everyone in the court, it was stated in open court that whatever this car was worth, it was not going to be able to pay this guy's lawyer to handle his case soup to nuts. He was gonna sell the car, as quickly as he could to hire his lawyer. He was going to burn through that money. And then, unless he took a plea deal very quickly, the court was going to have to end up appointing him a lawyer anyways. And in the meantime, the guy's not going to have a car to get to courts or his job.
Work.
Or
right.
Exactly, or any of these things. The system was setting him up to fail, and everyone was just sort of like, yeah, but that's the rule. He does have this asset, and he could sell it, and it was, what the car was just above whatever the threshold was for they were willing to look the other way. And it was very clear to me that it wasn't more efficient to run things this way in the aggregate, if this guy had a case and was going to try to go to trial and do all of these things. But among other things, it was a way for him it was assigned to him to knuckle under. That's how this stuff works, knuckle under.
Did that make you, was that always, you include the story, did that make you want to do the work you're doing? Or was there something else that inspired you to do so much research on this topic?
This topic, it's funny. I wouldn't have even thought of that as a piece of plea bargaining until I sat down to write this book and started writing about things like how we impose all of these financial costs on people. In the chapter you were talking about earlier, where I'm like, actually, maybe it is about money and I was wrong. But what inspired me to write the book, it's funny, you were saying before that I'm kind of combative when I disagree with people. I tend to tell them. That's why I went to law school in the first place. I'm an arguer, right? And I had one of those mothers, this Italian mother who's like, Carissa, stop arguing with me. You're not a lawyer. Go to law school if you want to argue. Stop arguing with me. Fold your laundry, whatever. And I went to law school because I thought that's what lawyers do. They just kind of argue with people. But I haven't stopped. I still argue with people, including my family, none of whom are lawyers. I ended up marrying a man that I met in law school, so they know two lawyers. They know me and my husband, but they don't know any other lawyers, and they like to tell me why I'm wrong. So now that I teach criminal law, they would say well, what we should really do is blah, 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 blah. And I'm like, no, actually that's wrong because sort of my standard move. And it became clear to me that they supported a lot of policies like mandatory minimum punishments because they believed this schoolhouse rock sort of fiction about how we treat people who are accused of crimes.
This is like the fourth time you've mentioned Schoolhouse Rock, and I know you're doing it as a metaphor because it has like We the People, the song about, the Constitution, the preamble, right? And it has how a bill becomes a law. But I am not actually aware, and I think I'm a student of Schoolhouse Rock. I'm not actually aware of the one about plea bargaining. Is that, are you using it as?
No, I'm just using it to refer to.
Because I was going to go check it out. Like, is there one about, I'm not going to go. Okay. I want to cut you off.
I'd have to check YouTube to see if they have a criminal law one.
They may. They have things about saving money. They have some things about adverbs and conjunctions.
Right. That's a good one. No, I just meant that, the I'm just a bill sitting on Capitol Hill. Like, that's how we make law in this country, unless you know anything about administrative agencies, for example. Exactly. Right?
So I want to tell you that I was, I read a book to sort of on different levels. And one level is the sort of that primal of like the, oh my God. Like I literally write OMG or like usually it's an exclamation mark. Like if something shocks me, I'll put like an exclamation mark. But like if something really shocks me, it gets an OMG. And it's very rare that I even go to that level in a book. But there were several. And I was shocked about how unjust so much of this was. And in particular, I wonder if you can talk about this guy named James, it's not his actual name, who was arrested for trespassing in his own building.
Yeah, this was a story that was told to me by a former public defender who's now a law professor, David Jaros, and we must have been at a conference or something, and he was just, people share these war stories, and he had this war story about a former client who got swept up in, these raids, the clean sweeps raids that the NYPD was doing, trying to keep people from showing up in buildings in certain neighborhoods to sell drugs. So they would come in and they would arrest everyone for trespassing unless they could prove to the officers that they were there for a legitimate purpose. So James, and it's not his real name, he was downstairs in the lobby when the police swarmed through. And as they're saying, like, we're arresting you for trespass. And he's like, what are you talking about? I live here. And they said, show us your ID. And he's like, I don't have my ID. It's up in my apartment. And they said, you can show it to the judge. And they swept him up and they brought him in and he spent the night in jail, which is
so can I stop you for 1 second? They could have just said, hey, we'll follow you up, go into your apartment.
Yeah. Oh,
but they took him in.
But they
shouldn't even been doing it to begin with, but like, okay. So they take him in.
Someone is standing in a building is not probable cause that they're trespassing. So there's a problem with them sweeping people up. They could have brought him up to get his ID. They didn't. They brought him in with dozens of other people. He sat in a cell all night. His public defender, my friend David, shows up and he has this conversation with him. He's like, look, they arrested him in my building. This is where I live. And David, my friend, said, okay, well, you're going to go out here and they're just going to ask you if you want to plead guilty or not guilty. Since you're not guilty, you should say not guilty. And then we'll just schedule another date for you to come down here.
Wait, can you stop? You say they. I'm just trying to. And there's no, like, David can't be like, because, my instinct would be, hey, judge, I got to tell you, this guy lives in the building. That's like, this is not a free speech zone. Your choices are guilty or not guilty. That's it.
Your choices are guilty or not guilty. And if you say not guilty, what will happen is the judge and the court clerk will set another date for you to come down, and you should come at that point with your ID, and we will get the charges dismissed. To which James responded, I've already missed work. This is ridiculous. He said, what happens if I plead guilty? And David told him it's a $100 ticket. They'll reduce this down to like a ticket, and it's $100.
Like a misdemeanor.
No, even less than that, like a violation, like a parking ticket, not even a misdemeanor.
I see. And then you don't have to come back.
You don't have to come back.
$100.
Pay $100. To which David responded, I lose more than $100 if I have to miss another day of work to come down here. James. James said, I'll miss another day of work if I have to do this. I'm going to plead guilty. And David was upset about this, but couldn't tell him, no, you have to do this. And I said, well, David, why didn't you say, he's innocent, and David, will bring the evidence back to court to show the prosecutor and the judge. And David said that's not how it works. The defendants always have to be there, even if they've been unlawfully and erroneously arrested. Obviously, David, the lawyer, could have brought a photocopy of this guy's ID to court, but that's not how the system works. The system does not care about the collateral damage that it inflicts on the people who, in this case, literally get swept up into the system through no fault of their own.
And in the case with James, you can kind of understand but it's even more pressure if your choice is you can get out right now, if you just plead guilty, or you're going to be in pretrial detention. You're going to be in jail for months, if not years. And those are some other situations. But before you get to those, the other shocking thing that I'm still like, my eyes are bugging out. This is about civil forfeiture. This guy named, how do you pronounce it? Is it Awa?
Awa, yeah, that's his name.
So can you tell me a little bit about this and sort of teach me a little bit more about civil forfeiture as you do?
Sure. So civil forfeiture is this idea that sometimes you can get convicted, and as part of your conviction, you'd have to pay a fine or maybe forfeit, like give to the government, some sort of, money or property that was involved in your crime. Civil forfeiture allows
like the ill-gotten gains is what you're thinking about, right?
Exactly.
Yep.
So if I make a bunch of money selling drugs, I don't get to keep that money. I have to forfeit it after I get convicted. Right. Also, to the instrumentalities, if I'm selling drugs out of my car, they can take the car too, even though it was legally my car. Okay. Civil forfeiture says you don't have to get a conviction to do that. We're going to treat it like a civil case. Lower burden of proof, fewer procedural protections for people. It's basically, we suspect that this was involved with a crime or the proceeds of a crime, and then it's up to you to affirmatively defend yourself. And if you don't show up and do all of that, we get to keep everything. So
they take it, and then you've got to go in and make the argument for why you deserve it back.
Exactly.
No trial. It's civil forfeiture, but not even a civil trial.
Not even a civil trial. And even if you are indigent, you are not entitled to the appointment of counsel because it is not a criminal case. So there is a group, the Institute for Justice. They do a lot of work on civil forfeiture. And they found out about this guy named Awa, who was an immigrant to the United States, who had been helping a church band who was touring around, and he was acting as their manager. And so he had the proceeds from the ticket sales from their concerts in the trunk of his car. He got pulled over by a police officer. I forget if it was he had a taillight out. He had some minor infraction.
Yeah.
The police officer speaks with him, thinks that Awa looks nervous. He asks Awa, "Are you nervous?" And he said, "Yes, I'm nervous. I'm being questioned by the police." He came from a country that was relatively totalitarian with an abusive police force. And the police officer was like, "Well, can I look in your trunk?" And Awa said yes. And that's when he found the money. And he said, "I'm going to keep this. I think you're selling drugs." Awa is a committed Christian who doesn't drink and who in his free time drives around church bands so that they can raise money for orphanages in Thailand. That's what he was doing. But they took the money. Gosh. Luckily,
a lot of money too,
right?
Money,
thousands of dollars that was going to go to the orphanage in Thailand. So luckily, someone in Awa's community was a lawyer, helped him get in touch with the folks at the Institute for Justice. They then, filed the papers necessary to get the money back.
So wait, I want to rewind because this is really interesting about civil forfeiture because the lawsuit is against the property. It's it's usually like the state of whatever or the United States versus $25,328.17 or something, right?
That's right.
They sue the property to take it. And then you as the claimant, so Awa is going to have to file an answer, to try to get it back. Okay, so he gets his lawyer who's going to file the answer.
He gets his lawyer who's going to file the answer, and just before the answer is due, the little town in Texas where he'd been pulled over decides to file a criminal warrant for his arrest. Now,
on the grounds of like the drug dealing or whatever, right?
Exactly.
Okay.
Now, AWOL lives in a different state. Maybe this was all happening in Oklahoma, and he lived in Texas. He lived in a different state. The Institute for Justice, they were keeping track of the case, so they found out about the warrants, and so they helped him get a defense attorney, and they helped him show up so that he could surrender and do all of these things. But the Institute for Justice had also reached out to the Washington Post, which ended up writing a story about this. And so they showed up in court for this initial appearance on the criminal case. And as they were leaving, the lawyer let the prosecutor know that the Washington Post story would be published within that day. And the charges were dropped immediately. And they got a telephone call saying, "Can you please give us your address so we can mail you a check for the money that we confiscated?" The Institute for Justice folks I think they're just fantastic. They're hilarious. They're a group of like hardcore libertarians. They care about this because they care about property rights. And they've developed such a reputation that if they enter an appearance in a case, the money will be given back immediately to moot the case because they don't want the Institute for Justice coming in to find out creating law and finding out about all of the terrible things that they're doing. The Washington Post ended up doing a big expose on civil forfeiture, and they found that these like little towns, especially in the Southwest, they're pulling people over and confiscating like $27 from their wallet, or like one of them's like a gold crucifix that the person was wearing. These are like working class people. One couple, they were pulled over, they took their money, and they said, if you try to get this money back, we will file criminal charges and your kids will be taken in by Child Protective Services.
By the way, that also was one of the oh my gods. This couple that you're describing pulled over, remind me of what they were pulled over for. I remember. It was driving in the left lane for more than, I don't know how many minutes without passing somebody.
That's right. It's obviously a very serious crime. Obviously a very serious crime.
It reminds me of like the Wild West when people would be on a stagecoach and it would be held up. What's going on?
It's funny. I've been, as part of some other research that I'm doing, I've been interviewing some prosecutors to ask them about low-level crimes, and marijuana possession in particular. And the question that we ask is, do you guys enforce these? And they're always like, we don't enforce all of them, blah, 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 blah. And one of the questions is, so do you support legalization? And many of them say no. And their reason is it is an important tool for law enforcement if they smell marijuana to be able to conduct an investigation to see if other crimes are being committed. They don't want to arrest people for the pot, but they want to be able to like search them and search their cars to see if they can find evidence for other crimes.
And the class issues around this are huge.
Yeah.
People who have, well, first of all, in Massachusetts where I live, recreational cannabis is legal, but anywhere else, wealthy people, if they're going to be using, drugs that are not legal, are going to be in their homes. No one's going to smell marijuana wafting out of the penthouse apartment. But I'm sure if they could say that, they could hop over the wall and probably see some insider trading happening inside that apartment. Okay, so it's an idea. Tool of law enforcement. Okay, but let's talk about, when I started reading the book and I said, wow, she's good, this is good. It was the first person you introduced us to who you returned to at the end. Oh. So can you tell me again tell me how you met Damien and why you used his story as a framing device, what you learned from him.
Yeah, so I wanted to speak to someone who was factually innocent. There's no question about it. And I wanted to speak to that person, a person who was factually innocent and nonetheless pleaded guilty. And there's an online registry of people who've been exonerated, and it lists certain details about them, like where they are, whether they pleaded guilty or went to trial. And Damien was one of several individuals here in the state of North Carolina who'd pleaded guilty to a murder that he hadn't committed. So this is in the western part of the state. A man was murdered in what looked like a robbery gone bad at his son's house, and the police suspected this local group of men who and Damien would tell you they were suspected because they weren't weren't on the straight and narrow path. Like they were doing other things that were not legal. They did not shoot or kill anyone, but they had been doing other things that weren't legal. He didn't get into the details about what. So they suspected them. They pulled a bunch of them in and started questioning them. They scared a 16-year-old boy, Silly, who confessed and immediately recanted as soon as the police officer who was screaming in his face left the room. He said, "I only said that because I was afraid of him." But they used that confession to pressure everyone into pleading guilty, including Damien. He pleaded guilty. He ended up serving more than 10 years in prison. And it's a terrible story. He was only recently pardoned he was actually pardoned while the book was in the editing process, and I was able to add that happy postscript that he'd been pardoned. But he was exonerated by DNA evidence. They found the people who did them. They have confessed. It is quite clear that another group of men.
And as you know, that other group of men was on the list of people who had possibly done it. It wasn't like they came out of the blue.
No.
They knew that this group, but they went with someone else after a coerced confession.
They knew about this group. They had some things they could test for DNA evidence. They got the DNA results back before Damien finished pleading guilty. There was surveillance footage from a gas station that mysteriously got taped over. I mean, this is a bad case, and I can say I'm happy to say.
Oh, wait. There was footage from a gas station.
Yeah.
And what was it? Was it exonerating footage?
Presumably it was exonerating footage.
But what happened to that videotape?
The videotape, which showed a group of men putting gas in a car near the place of the murder, near the time of the murder, after it was taken into evidence, somehow got the relevant portion of it taped over with another show. So
with like a soap opera.
With like a television show. So like best case scenario, you have best case scenario, you have misconduct by somebody who's using state property. Worst case scenario, you have somebody who's trying to get rid of evidence that might exonerate these people because they decided that these were the people who did it.
So he has this murder charge, and then what happens?
He pleads guilty. His lawyer encourages him to plead guilty. He said, "I've seen cases like this before. The jury will convict. You should plead guilty." He took a deal for I think it was 12. I think he served 12 years in prison. It was more than 10 years in prison. And he eventually got out. After he was out, he was eventually exonerated. And I interviewed him about the process, and it was really tough because although he'd agreed to speak with me, and his lawyer, I'm at the University of North Carolina, his lawyer is a UNC grad. The lawyer set up the interview. The lawyer was there for it. Even though all of these things were true, like this was something in Damien's past that made him really upset. It was a tough interview to conduct, and I'm sure it was obviously significantly worse for him. I was asking him about the worst part of his life, and I was really grateful that he spoke with me. But I was shocked because at the end of the interview, I asked him the gotcha question, like this is what I'm going to open the book with. Do you regret pleading guilty? And he said no. He said he regretted not getting a better deal. And he did not regret pleading guilty to a murder that he didn't commit. His only regret was that his lawyer didn't get him something where he could have served less time.
And that's because even though plea bargaining involves people being pressured to give up their constitutional rights, they know that the system they're being thrown in has so many other problems that he thought he would be convicted of a crime he didn't commit. Is that really the bottom line? That
is the bottom line. He's a black man living in the South. He did not think that the jury was going to acquit him. He did not think that he would get acquitted. And he thought he was thinking only about how little time can I spend in jail. And I have to say, having gone through that website of all of the people who've been exonerated and looking at how many of them were convicted at trial, I can't say he was wrong. I can't say that jury would have acquitted him. I can't say that the prosecutor would have turned over the DNA evidence so they could have presented it. I can't say that the jury would have been suspicious enough about that surveillance tape getting taped over. I mean, one of the reasons maybe that we're so comfortable punishing people without trials is that we haven't taken the time and the effort to make sure that our trials are particularly good at sorting the guilty from the innocent.
Mm-hmm. So the book, I can't recommend it enough. It's great. And at some point I want to assign it. There's a course I teach called Money, Law, and Power. I started it last year, and I have 4 books the students read, and I'm changing one over every year. And I want to add yours because it's really good. It gives you a new perspective. It teaches some of the, students are going to get refreshed about some of the doctrine they know, but also given a more realistic perspective of the existing criminal justice system. And it's not all depressing. So I want to turn a bit to the encouraging aspects before we close. There are several judges and prosecutors who are finding their own power to try to make things better. Thinking of Judge Calabresi in Ohio, Judge Goodwin in West Virginia, Rachel Rollins, and others. Can you talk a bit about what you find encouraging, maybe with what they're doing or anything else?
Yeah, I did. I'll talk about Judge Calabresi because it was so wonderful to hear what he had been doing. So Judge Calabresi had been a trial court judge in the state court in Ohio, and then President Trump appointed him to be a federal court judge. So both times people come in and out of his courtrooms. They plead guilty a lot. When I was finishing writing this book, I was close to the end, and I got invited to speak on a panel talking about Judge Rakoff's book about, the criminal justice system and how bad it is. And at the very end of this panel for the National Constitution Center, Jeff Rosen, the director, said, does anyone have any recommendations for reform? And I said, yes, we shouldn't make misdemeanor defendants come to court for court dates. And Rosen was very nice about it, but it was a little apparent that was not the sort of reform he was looking for because, what a boring technical thing.
Oh, I love it. No, but you're thinking, but it sounds, what's so funny, if I had been in the audience and I didn't know about James from your book, I'd be like, what is Carissa like? What a fucking technocrat, right? But now I know it comes from the heart. I know where it comes from and how important it is.
There are millions and millions and millions of misdemeanor defendants, and they plead guilty not because, they're facing decades in prison. They plead guilty because it's a pain in the neck for them to have to come back all the time, and the stakes are so low for pleading guilty. So anyway, I say that...
And wait, stop you for a second. The numbers that you put in your book, 13 million misdemeanors charged a year. And is that federal and state?
Federal and state. That's the best estimate.
And that's 80% of crimes.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
This is big.
It's huge.
This is not small potatoes. This is a lot of unpaid hours, people out of work. Okay, so
Definitely.
You say this. You say this at this conference.
It goes over like a lead balloon. I get a telephone call a few days later. Judge Calabresi had been listening, and he was like, I just wanted to let you know, I instituted this a couple of years ago, and I agree with you. It's really important. We should do it. And I was like, wait, okay, spell your name. Can I put you in my book? Can I make clear what's happening?
So just to be clear, what he's doing is after that first appearance, if you plead not guilty or whatever, you don't have to come back to court. Your lawyer just shows up for you and handles the paperwork for you.
Yeah, and he's like, look, this is what we do in civil cases. Like, if I'm suing Walmart because I slipped and fell in the Walmart near my house, like the corporate officers from Walmart aren't showing up for those court dates. Their lawyers are. And then if there's a trial, that's when they have to show up. Or if they're going to, do something else where they have to be there, like signing off on it. I don't know. I don't know civil procedure very well, but very little happens that they need to be there for. It's just the lawyers. We don't do that with criminal defendants. We make them come back all the time because we don't care about their time and because we treat them like children who've misbehaved. Like this is part of the punishment is that they have to show up all of the time and have the judge ask them questions and make sure that they're following their release.
So speaking of children, I have to get you to tell me the one thing that, on top of everything else, endeared me to you even more was the thing that you noticed in court, that you can't, there's some prohibitions. You can't eat, you can't drink, you can't be on your phone, and what else can't you do?
You can't read. You can't read a newspaper or a book in court. It's forbidden in Brooklyn and I think in some of the other New York courts as well. Yeah, it's a rule.
And so this is outrageous because it's you can't stare at your iPhone. People are just going to get anxious and not a newspaper, nothing. And so tell me about this judge what happened?
They're in detention. It's like they're in detention. They just had to sit there. So I was not the first person to say, that's crazy, I can't believe this is happening. There was a juvenile public defender who said, like, look, my clients are sitting there. It's hard for them to sit still. They're missing class. They're missing school to be here. I can't believe we have a rule that they can't read. We should be encouraging literacy in these juveniles who've been accused of being delinquent. We should not be saying, don't read. We should be saying the opposite. And she convinced the chief judge to reverse the rule. And the last I heard, they were working with one of the big publishing houses to actually have bookcases with books in the courtroom so that even if the kids, who were waiting for their cases to be called didn't have a book, they could, pick up a copy of Harry Potter or whatever and read something.
Well, I have an idea. I'm going to find that. I want to find that whoever's in charge of it. I'd like to send a copy of your book so it could be there. I think the lawyers and juveniles could benefit from learning about how the system is stacked against them. So,
sadly, I think they know. I think it's the rest of us, Jen. Right? I think it's. I wrote the book so that I could win the fight with my family at Thanksgiving dinner. Right? They're like, the system is okay. It's working just fine. And I was like, you're wrong. Like, let me explain why. And it just took 200 and some odd pages to do it, unfortunately.
Wait, so when they read the book, are they convinced or not?
They've been very kind about it. I think at a minimum, they've decided they don't want to fight with me about this anymore. They'll fight with me about something else.
I just have to say that I wanted to go to law school because when I was a teen, I would argue with my father because I believed, I'd heard from my cousin that women did not have equal rights under the Constitution. Oof. And he said, no, they do. And my cousin Lisa, who'd gone through law school, said, no, they don't. So I thought that I would go to law school and find out the answer to that question. So that's a whole other can of worms. But it's, it's always good to have parents that you can debate things with because, if you're going to be someone who argues, you might as well learn at home.
That's right.
Okay, so I have this random question to ask you. So you have this really fancy title. You are, let's see, you've got this. Yeah, it's a great title. You are the Anne Shea Ransdell and William Garland Buck Ransdell Jr. Distinguished Professor of Law. And I saw that and I thought, like, who are these people? And I wondered if you've ever, when you got that chair, whether you looked into who those folks were.
Yeah, I had the opportunity to have lunch with Mrs. Ransdell soon after I joined the faculty here at Carolina. She and her husband Buck were both graduates of UNC. She was, one of, I think she said 5 women in her graduating class. And Buck, after he practiced for a little while, he ran and became the local prosecutor a couple of counties over. So he passed away some time ago, and she endowed the chair. She was going to endow the chair for him, and I think my dean sort of convinced her, why would it just be his name? Like, why not your name too? And so when I got recruited to come here, my dean was wonderful, and I was delighted and over the moon to come. But he told me, I want to give you this chair. It's named after these 2 graduates of the school. I'd met my husband in law school, and then we got married like the weekend of graduation. Mrs. Ransdell and I spoke a lot about that, but it was, I thought, also really touching that it was named after the couple, and so much of my research focuses on prosecutors. And it's funny, I had this lunch with Mrs. Ransdell before I started writing this book, and one of the things that she said at lunch was, Buck didn't do plea bargains. Like, you committed a crime, and if you want to plead guilty, that's up to you, but if you want to go to trial, that's what happens. He didn't run his office that way. And that's interesting because, we're not talking about that many decades ago that you could be the prosecutor in a populous county, and that would be the approach that you take. And I think about that every once in a while because so many people, I think the system is this way because it couldn't be any different, but it was pretty different not that long ago.
Mm-hmm. So is there Anything I didn't ask you that you wanted to talk about?
Ooh. Well, I wanted to
yes.
I wanted to ask you a question. Is that okay?
I might answer. You can go ahead and ask.
I wanted to ask you, because you've written 2 books now, when do you think someone should write a book, and what should they know before they do it? These sorts of books, these like, let me tell you something about the world books.
I think everybody's different. I think the key thing is you only write books because you can't help yourself, right? Like, I think it's I've always wanted to be a writer. So I don't know if someone says, well, these people are like, well, they sort of say it as offhand. Well, I've, been thinking of writing a book, and then, I've been thinking of having it be a bestseller. It's like, well, that's nice. And I've been thinking of being a ballerina, but that's just not how things work. Like, I think if you want to be a writer, you just write. But the one thing people should know, which I didn't know, is that nonfiction is very different than fiction. You write nonfiction based on a proposal. You don't write the whole book and then try to get it published. And it's astonishing to me how I've had people come to me and say, what should I do? And I say, do not write the whole book. Write the proposal, write a chapter, and then, you go from there. Either you go right to, if you're an academic, you go right to an academic publisher, or maybe you get an agent. I have said that to some people, and some of them have gone ahead and literally said to me, well, I'm just going to write the whole book first. And then they can't sell it. And I just feel, why did you even ask me that? So that's what I'm saying. Nonfiction, it's sort of like writing a magazine article. You don't write it first and then place it. Yeah. Is that what happened with you? Oh my gosh. Did you write the whole book first, Carissa?
No. Okay. No, I talked about writing this book for years to win arguments with my family, but also because, I saw a book, The New Jim Crow, change the national conversation. And it was funny. I was
Michelle Alexander's
book. I was talking to a colleague who said, the brilliant thing about Michelle Alexander's book was she took something that everyone in the every criminal law professor knew, and she made the rest of the world pay attention. And I thought that was just, that's such an admirable thing to do. So I thought to myself after my friend said that to me, I said, if I could do that for one thing, it would be plea bargaining, because plea bargaining is just such a mess, and I wish everyone knew about it. And so, frankly, I talked about writing this book for 4 years before I was having lunch with a friend of a friend who asked me this, and I said that, and she said that she had just spoken to a literary agent who was just striking out, who was looking to sign authors, and then. Mm-hmm. And then the rest of it is him helping me figure out how to write a book, which is very kind of him.
Bringing it back to childbirth.
I will say writing the book took so much longer than having a baby.
Yes, and it's not just like the first book, it's not just like having a baby, but it's like the baby goes off to college too, and like whatever, all at once. I think the second book is easier. And I'm on my 3rd book, so I think that it's really good to forget the painful stuff. And there's a lot of muscle memory, though. I think when you do it another time, I think you do it because you want to torture yourself in some ways. Yeah. But like you said, you've been thinking about it for a long time, and I think the key thing is there's something that you want to say. But what's so important is what you did, which is if you have all the answers, why are you writing the book? And you were able, I'm still amazed that you were able to reveal some of your process and some of your this is what I found out, but not too much, like just the right amount. And so I think I'm going to ask you, maybe you can read my manuscript when it's done and give me advice.
Oh my God, I would love that.
You would?
So much.
It's going to be on tax policy though.
You know what?
What?
I think my tax colleagues are some of the most interesting people. Honest to God, some of the most interesting
people. I know.
People.
I'm talking to tax people. I love them. They're so friendly.
They're fascinating. Yep. They see the world through a completely I never took tax in law school, so I don't even understand the theoretical framework of tax, but I get so excited when they give a faculty workshop and I get to talk to them about their work. It's so awesome.
Okay, well, you'll have to give me some of their names because I'm interviewing everyone on the planet for this one.
Oh, yeah, definitely. I will
good.
Send you an email. I went to dinner last night with a friend who said, your book is on my table, but I haven't read it yet. And I said, oh, your book is on my table, and I also haven't read it yet. So, but
well,
I have read
guess
your
what?
book now.
Carissa, I bought your book right when it came out, but I didn't read it until this week. And I was like, wow, she can write. Because I'm always suspicious with these law professors, right? Myself too. I mean, we're not taught to write in a way that's always accessible. Your book's incredibly accessible.
Oh, thank you. I have to say, it's been a little hard to go back to writing our regular stuff where there's a footnote at the end of every sentence and your language is very technical and not nearly as breezy. And let me tell you the story rather than provide you with a bunch of footnotes. But
I have a theory that it's so cynical of me. But the reason why law review articles and notes are so sort of meant to be sort of stripped of anything other than sort of the doctrine and the analysis and the data is because, more senior faculty just want to be briefed on something so they can do the more interesting work. Okay, so great. I'll try to find you when you're back making the conference rounds.
And I'm really excited about the book. Please do send me the manuscript. I would love to read it.
You're the best. Thank you. I could have spoken with Carissa for hours. I'm just hoping that we run into each other or make a plan to see each other in real life because I have so many more questions for her about her book and her research. And I think we would really be good collaborators. There are a few things from the book that I didn't get a chance to cite to or ask her about. And I wanted to provide a little more context. When she was talking about the guy who went by the pseudonym of James, the man who was arrested for trespassing in his own building, and she talked about the sweep, that was called Operation Clear Halls. And at the time, between 2007 and 2012 in New York, there were 16,000 people arrested as part of this Operation Clear Halls, which just stunned me. It was not just a one-off. It was a process which has now ended. There, again, I cannot encourage folks who care about criminal justice reform. I can't encourage you enough to read this book. It changed my perspective mostly about civil forfeiture because I already was suspicious about plea bargaining. But what is the most stunning is how much more of a problem, if you think it's a problem, that it has become. I'll be back next week with another show as we continue to explore the writing process and nonfiction world together. Let us know what you think. Send me an email at bookedup@politicon.com. I also love to hear from you by mail. P.O. Box 147, Northampton, Massachusetts 01061. To keep up with the show and our featured authors, follow Booked Up on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen. And please give Booked Up a 5-star review because it really does help other people find us.